Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Perry sent me a note and said, Steve, do you see the story about the guy who got the judgment against the city? And the city won't pay it. And I had not seen it, so I read it. And it's interesting because that's kind of what happened, but not perfectly what happened. And there's a distinction here that I think the news is kind of missing. And I'll try my best to explain this. But from the newsobserver.com website by Virginia Bridges, a federal jury awarded Daryl Howard $6 million. The city of Durham will not pay him. But the first thing an attorney is going to ask is, well, who was the jury award against? Well, it wasn't against the city of Durham. It was against an employee of the city of Durham. And that's the distinction. So a man who successfully fought to have 2 murder convictions overturned was pardoned by the governor and won a $6 million judgment for civil rights violations by a Durham police detective. He'll likely never see most of the money after the Durham City Council decided it won't pay. So I've talked before recently about people who spend time in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Here's another example of a guy who was in prison and it turns out he shouldn't have been there. So Daryl Howard couldn't believe it when told that the city wouldn't indemnify a retired detective, meaning it won't pay the jury's judgment. The determination is particularly concerning and confusing since the city paid millions of dollars for attorneys to attack Howard's character during the trial. Howard and his attorney said, Durham officials have fought him every step of the way. I proved my innocence. I went through every court, he said. Every judge says what this was, even the governor. I don't understand that. Now I have to fight again. So on December 1st, a federal jury awarded Howard $6 million after finding that the detective fabricated evidence and performed an inadequate investigation that led to Howard being wrongly convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and a count of arson. After a month-long trial, it took the jury an hour to reach a decision. 1 hour. The city has spent, meanwhile, more than $4 million defending this case. Legal expenses have been paid out of a fund for uninsured legal liabilities. Howard and his attorney said the city, which employed the detective for 36 years, gave the detective the power that led to Howard spending over 2 decades in prison or in jail. In a move that Howard's and the detective's attorneys described as unprecedented, the Durham City Council decided in a series of closed session meetings not to pay the judgment on the detective's behalf. So the lawsuit was between the man and the detective. The detective did work for the city, but apparently they didn't sue the city or the city wasn't found liable. They simply awarded a judgment against this detective. And everyone assumed, well, the city will pay that on behalf of the detective. And the city has said, no, he won't. And some people are saying, but if he won't pay that judgment on his behalf, why did you defend him? And that's an interesting distinction, but it happens a lot where someone will pay for the defense or handle the defense of somebody or an entity. Insurance companies do it all the time, where they cover a defense of somebody, but they might not be willing to pay the judgment. And it's the duty you have to defend somebody versus the duty you have to indemnify somebody. So I am not 100% certain on how this played out, but it's very, very clear the city is saying you sued the detective, not us. In legal filings, the city has also indicated it will ask the plaintiff here, Howard, to pay the legal fees of 2 city employees who were dismissed from the lawsuit. The judgment marks the first time a jury has found a bad faith finding against a Durham employee, City Attorney Kimberly Rayberg said. She initially spoke to a reporter last month and responded to follow-up questions in emails. A city resolution establishes a uniform standard in addressing claims against the city and outlines a policy to defend officers and employees against civil claims and judgments. Unless the city has evidence or information to indicate otherwise, the city generally proceeds under the presumption that, however conduct may have been portrayed in a lawsuit, the employee was engaged in the good faith execution of their duties on behalf of the city and was thus entitled to a defense. City Council decided not to pay the judgment during closed session meetings between December and February, according to Rayberg. The meetings were closed for attorney-client consultation to respond to demands made by the plaintiff here, as well as the defendant's attorneys. The city's resolution states that it's in the public interest to settle judgments against the city if the facts and circumstances of the claim or the suit in which the judgment is entered show that the officer or employee was engaged in good faith performance of his duties on behalf of the city when the act or omission giving rise to the claim or suit occurred. In which that email the city attorney wrote, there's an emphasis on good faith. A jury of Mr. Dowdy's peers, that's the defendant, determined that Mr. Dowdy engaged in fabrication of evidence and bad faith. So the mayor declined to comment on the ongoing legal issue. When asked why the city would pay for attorneys but not the judgment, the attorney said initially the city and other employees were named in the lawsuit, but those claims were dismissed or dropped by the time the case made it to trial. She also said some of the concerns raised during the trial weren't outlined from the very beginning. Now, one of the plaintiff's attorneys contends the facts of the case were available to the city from the beginning when the city decided to represent the defendant. It agreed to defend his conduct. They go through the whole process. They pay all of that money. They enrich a bunch of lawyers, and then the moment they have to pay the actual victim, they say we're not going to back this. He said Durham's stance is indefensible, morally wrong, and inconsistent with the progressive values that the city leaders often tout. Do you know how hard it is in a system that gives police officers almost absolute immunity, that gives prosecutions complete immunity? So it's not easy to win, I can tell you that, he continued, and he, plaintiff, did, and it is offensive that is not being honored, referring to the judgment. Now, the interesting thing about this case is for nearly 3 decades, this man has been fighting to get out of jail and then to get some kind of compensation. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison in 1995, but he finally convinced a judge to vacate his convictions in 2014. Prosecutors, of course, appealed that, but the man is now nearly 60, and he was represented by attorneys from the Innocence Project. And they, of course, seek exonerations for people who have been wrongfully convicted. Howard's hearings outlined new DNA evidence made available after the court approved new tests in 2010. They found that DNA from a man affiliated with a gang that Howard had said was responsible for the killings. They found that on the victim. And so, interestingly, the case actually mentions District Attorney Mike Nifong and Durham Police. And the court held that Nifong and the police withheld crucial evidence from Howard during the trial. After another hearing, Howard won his freedom after Hudson vacated Howard's convictions in 2016. Prosecutors did not pursue new charges. Nifong, of course, was the assistant district attorney, later disbarred for prosecutorial misconduct in the Duke University lacrosse case for ethics violations. And I just caught that in the story. There's much more to the story, much more to the story. But again, that's from the News Observer, and Virginia Bridges wrote it. Perry sent it to me. But the man who was wrongfully convicted sues several entities, including the detective that he says framed him. And by the time they get to trial, there appear to only be 2 entities left: plaintiff and the defendant. Plaintiff is the man who was wrongfully convicted, spent time in prison. The defendant is the detective he says framed him. The other city employees are out, and apparently the city itself is not named as a defendant here. Either way, what winds up happening is he wins the trial in that he gets a judgment against the defendant personally for several $million, $6 million. So he has a $6 million judgment against an individual who I believe is a retired detective now. $6 million judgment. And it does not appear that the retired detective is a millionaire and probably doesn't have the money to pay the judgment. So how much money can you squeeze out of the guy? Probably not $6 million. And so a lot of people who would hear of a case like this would just immediately assume, oh, you sue the detective, you sue other people who worked in the case, and you sue the city that employs them. And it's not uncommon that you sue someone and you sue their employer. And to do that, you make the allegation, if it fits, that the employer was doing something wrong in how it trained people, how it supervised people, how it hired people, how it disciplined people. And if you can show that there was negligence there, you can often get the liability of the person to be held against their employer. And again, I've not seen the lawsuit in this case. I just learned about it yesterday. But the judgment that this man winds up with is a $6 million judgment against the detective himself, and that's it. Now, a lot of people assumed the city was going to pay because they paid for the defense of the detective. But as the city points out, they actually picked up the defense of the detective and at least two other people that had been named originally or initially in this lawsuit, and two of them got dismissed. So the duty to defend is not always the same as the duty to pay a judgment. So I'll be interested to see here, because it might be because of a public backlash. The city could change its position here. But you're asking them to change their position in a way that will cost them $6 million. Because if they don't have to pay this judgment, I can see them saying, well, let's not pay it and see what happens. The question, of course, is how much money do you spend defending that decision? So we'll see what happens. But as of right now, a federal jury has awarded Daryl Howard $6 million, and the city of Durham will not pay that judgment. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Bono and the Edge walk into a Dublin bar, and the bartender says, "Oh no, not you two again."